Hello, everyone. This is Carmen Vertullo with your Fastener Training Minute, coming to you from the Fastener Training Institute and AIM Testing Laboratory in beautiful El Cajon, California. And it is truly beautiful here today. I'm not going to tell you what's going on right now, but this is a pretty historical time we're living in. And there's a lot of points being made out there right now. But I'm going to tell you about a different kind of point. This is the kind of point that we find on the end of a screw or bolt. And it's not a very pointy point, but it is a point, and the point has a point. And if you don't have the point, you're going to get the point. So when I come back, I'm going to tell you why the point on the end of a screw or bolt is very important.
Knowledge is the key to success in the fastener industry, and the Fastener Training Institute has the tools you need to succeed. From advanced to beginners training courses, the Fastener Training Institute provides a wide variety of resources to boost your team's ability to operate at an elite level. Go to fastenertraining.org to see the schedule of online and in-person classes coming up, and reach out with any questions or requests for custom course materials. The Fastener Training Institute, fastenertraining.org.
Well, welcome back, everybody. This is Carmen Vertullo with the Fastener Training Minute. Today, talking about a thing called point. It's a feature that we find on the end of hex cap screws and other types of externally threaded fasteners. And it has a very specific requirement, and it serves a very important function. Imagine a threaded fastener, externally threaded fastener, a bolt or screw. When you look at the end of it, it usually has what you would like to describe as a chamfer. And that is the correct terminology, a chamfer. The standards refer to this chamfer as a point. And if we were to look at one of our more common standards for hex cap screws, ASME B18.2.1, for example, it has a very specific requirement for that point. And the reason is because if there is no point on the end of the bolt, what could easily happen, or the end of the screw, because as a matter of fact, bolts are not required to have the point, but screws are. If there is no point, the last thread on the end of the screw, it just wipes out to almost nothing. It can be almost as sharp as a razor blade. And that point is very vulnerable to damage. Therefore, if that last thread gets dinged or bent, it won't take the nut. And so if we put a little chamfer on the end of that, we keep that from happening. And especially with large bolts over half an inch, but even down to a quarter of an inch, if they bang around in a package or get dropped on that thread, it will bend. But this is what ASME B18.2.1 says about points in paragraph 2.4. I guess correctly called a section 2.4. Unless otherwise specified, bolts need not be pointed. So no points for bolts. Products designated as screws, with the exception of lag screws, we know what a lag screw is, already has a very pointy point, are required to have a chamfered point. IFI note, chamfered point lengths should be not less than 1, but not more than 2 thread pitches from the end of the screw. The point diameter at the extreme end of the screw should be no greater than the minimum minor diameter of the screw's thread. Now, that's not part of the standard. That's just an IFI note because I'm reading this from the IFI version of the standard. It goes on to say, the chamfer angle may vary depending on the manufacturing process. When specified, the chamfer angle should be considered a reference dimension only. The presence of a point is to reduce the possibility of damage to the leading threads and promote ease of assembly with a tapped hole or nut. Point features not defined in a given product standard are at the discretion of the manufacturer. Now, if you were to look at a manufacturing process for a cold formed part that was a hex cap screw, you would see this progression as it goes through. And at one point in the process, there's a very subtle change. That is, all of a sudden, before it goes to thread rolling, after it's been headed, after it's been extruded, after it's been maybe trimmed. I don't know, trim maybe comes after pointing. I don't know, someone would know that, but somewhere in there, that there's a point put on the end of the screw. And that's generally done with a material removal process, such as some kind of a machining or a grinding. It could be done with forming, but it's generally done with material removal. And that also is more friendly to the thread rolling process. So if we look at other inch standards, ASME B18.3 for socket screws, It has a very similar call out to this requirement. It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar. However, it does, as we know, socket screws start at a very small size. So one of the get out of jail free cards, and this can get us into trouble, is that it's note 8 from table 1 will tell us, I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's got very similar stuff to what we just read, except it gives us the requirement that screw sizes up to and including size 8, the chamfer is optional. So below number 8, you don't have to have the chamfer or what they call the point, and we have had issues with that in the past. What brings this up for me is we recently had a client who made a large bucket load of long 3/8-24 socket head cap screws. They were 8 or 10 inches long. Sent them to us. We tested them. They were fine. Sent them to the plater, got them back, got them to the customer. The customer rejected them because some of them would not take a nut. They sent them to us. They said, inspect these threads. We inspected the threads. They were fine. However, we did notice that there was no point and some of the leading threads were damaged. So that was the issue there. Fortunately, those screws probably can be repaired. They're long, expensive screws. Be a hand operation to grind that point on, but we always want to have the point. I'm going to just go to two more places. Let's say B18.2.6, structural bolting also requires a point. It's a much more defined point and a larger, deeper point than other bolting. And you would expect that because structural bolts are kind of used in a clunky, heavy, rough application. And then finally, if we go into our ISO, our metric standards, if we look at it, for example, ISO 4762 for the socket head cap screws, it goes to another whole standard called ISO 4753, which has a list of all kinds of points in it. And in that standard, it says we should use a point called a chamfered point for sizes above M4, and for M4 and below, we can use as rolled, which means essentially no point. So again, the small screws in the ISO system don't require points. Above M4 does, and there's specific requirements are in ISO 4753. Well, I hope you got the point of this point. It's very important that threaded fasteners have a point because without a point, you got no point. Well, this has been Carmen Vertullo with the Fastener Training Minute. Thanks for listening.